Howdy. Today I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the desire to be remembered, which is something that when I was younger, uh, even younger than I am now, I used to think about quite a lot, like in my high school sort of days. Very sort of like existential sort of type thinking. What happens uh, when you die? Not in terms of an afterlife, in terms of the legacy that you leave behind on Earth and how people remember you for what you did while you were here. And yeah, it's interesting because I sort of had this mental framework and sort of set method of problem solving at the time that is very different to what I have now when I approach these sorts of questions, which is just interesting to me to come to completely different conclusions, on something that I had once spent quite a while thinking about. But contemplating it more recently, I think I've come up with a sort of a better strategy, which I'll share with you today, and you can let me know what you think. In my younger days, I used to think that a good way to be remembered would be to have some sort of living artifact of your life. So if you don't go down in the history books as someone who's super famous, then how are you going to be remembered? How are you going to make sure that your name is never said for the last time, presumably ever? Very sort of how do you prolong, this entity of you in terms of like a worldly impact. And I thought a living artifact, like just a document of some kind that could be passed down the generations. If I sat down one day and I wrote a one pager, with my name, a little like a one page autobiography or something, and just uh, like with an instruction at the end saying, and you pass this down to your firstborn, and so on. And I thought that was pretty good at the time. I was quite proud of myself for having come up with that. Um, but now with a bit more humility, I look at that and I think that it is probably not a foolproof way to go. It makes sense, like this sort of like a living artifact, like something that could go in a museum or whatever, something that has your name on it and through which you can be remembered, even if it's not by your name, but if it's something that you've contributed, some content that you've created, something substantial that when people, if it's content when they consume it, or if it's something else just when they observe it, that it's because of you. I thought that would be a good way to be remembered, and that met that desire that I had. But not everyone has kids, and if you do, and then your kids don't, or they do and their kids don't, you see where I'm going with this, right? Like the generational tree, sometimes finishes, right? And so that thought process that I had it's not foolproof, you know. Something that can be handed down the generations is good for as long as that family name continues. However, if anything threatens that, well, that's now at that moment in time the last time that you were remembered. And I think everyone has this sort of desire, or maybe if they're not actively seeking out this way in which to be remembered, they are still pursued by fear of the opposite. They are anxious about what it would mean to not be remembered, which, can manifest itself in different ways, in terms of, having a fear of death, probably, right? Most commonly. And I think there'd be other things as well. It would make people very, very concerned about what goes on around them. It could probably lead to, a lot of ego that people have because they're trying to do, too much while they're here with the thought that once they're gone, like that's it, there's no more them. It'll be just as if before they existed. But that's not how history works, is it? Um, we still learn about people who've gone before us. So there is this opportunity to make a mark on the world. And even if you're not changing the world, there's still the opportunity to be remembered. And I think a lot of people have that as an inherent desire. They may suppress it, they may lose interest, or come to worry more about other things. But I think everyone is sort of born with that desire to want to do something with their lives that is meaningful. And I think that's one of the ways we express that. Similarly to my original solution, my new one does rely on having children. I think a good way to be remembered is living through others, somewhat in the sense of, sacrifice and giving up, and giving up yourself, and being represented, by the fruits that you sow in other people's lives. Because once your life is gone, theirs continues. And even once theirs fade, they go on to impact other people. It's like a pay it forward sort of thing, and the way I think that having a few children accomplishes that is it increases the amount of potentially good in the world. So say you're a good fella and you take onto yourself a good bride. That's two good people in the world, right? And at some point, in a few years, hopefully a fair few, but in a few years, those two people ain't there anymore. And so what can you do with that? Well, you could have no kids, right? That's like a net loss of two in terms of good people in the world. You could have one kid, but then, well, you're still down one, right? And they're probably going to grow up without anyone to play with. Two, that's your nuclear family, right? Or I guess it was the way it was then. That was a pretty good way to go. But at least that's you're even now, right? You've not reduced the amount of good in the world when it comes to the next generation. Three or more, that's the place to be. Because in being fruitful and multiplying, if you're raising good children, as you should, when you undertake such a noble venture as to rear a child, you've now increased the amount of capacity for good in the world in terms of how many children there are that will grow, hopefully, into capable adults who can make that contribution to the world. So say out of the two of you, you think, okay, well, I could go and I could be a rocket scientist, or I can go and be, super famous, do some, a major scientific breakthrough, right? That's your two people dedicating themselves to that, and giving back to the world. But if you're having more than just the two of you, if you're giving that as an inheritance, this quality life and this good childhood to somebody, multiple somebodies, well, now there's 3 or 4 or however many kids you have, chances of going and doing those things, So I think, okay, I could be a rock star or whatever. If you have, I don't know, let's say you have 5 kids, right? What's the probability that 1 in 5 goes on to be pretty successful? Probably quite high. If you do a good job. And so that's what I'm thinking about at the moment, is that a way to be remembered is by sacrificing for others. And that doesn't have to be in terms of having children. You can just be a good person and do charitable works and give to others in a less direct way than when you're the steward of young children. You're going to be a foster parent, adopt, and give back to the world like that. I think that's actually a really good way to be remembered, is not in terms of your name and what you did, but in terms of what was possible because of you. If you chose to, abstain from helping anybody else for the rest of your life, unless you were really, really good at that in a controversial way, such that you were, scandalizing people and you were immortalized in history through that, that's not a very significant life, and not one that anyone is going to be particularly kind to remember. Whereas if you make the most with what you're given and maybe make more out of it than what the average person does, I think that's pretty meaningful. And when I think about that sort of feels That fills my desire to be remembered, you know? And I think the way it was then, back in them old days, was very, familial. Someone's success, you know, a blessing would be upon, thou and thy father's house, or a curse. You would really think about people in terms of their family lines. And so I think just participating in that is a pretty good way to go. That's all for now. See you later.